Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Film Score Podcast. As mentioned, this is kind of a bonus episode, 1 week earlier than normal, but it's been a busy month, so kind of had to double down. Today, my guest is one of the modern ambient legends, Tim Hecker. And I say that, and yet, near the end of our conversation, you will hear him talk about why he does not like the ambient moniker, and it's actually something that is not unique to him. There have been others who have felt the same way, the limiting nature and perhaps the inaccuracy of that genre tag. But Tim and I jumped on to talk because of the new film that he scored, Infinity Pool, which is one hell of a wild ride. And I think there's an unrated cut coming out at some point soon, which promises to be even wilder. Tim's score for this is really interesting as well. It's very frightening, very unsettling, and he crafts this using a number of very strange sounds and noises brought together largely through improvisation. It's a tricky score, and so is the film. They're pieces of art not for everybody, but if it's your style, there's a lot to like in both. And I'd recommend giving them a chance just because they're both so out there. Now, one note on this talk, it actually starts basically in the middle of Tim and I having a conversation. And a little peek behind the scenes, I'll often have a quick small talk before I start an interview, just to break the ice a little bit, especially when I haven't talked with the composer previously. But Tim and I were having such an interesting conversation that I felt like it would break the momentum if I stopped it, said, all right, are you ready to have the interview, etc. Instead, we just hit record, and you're catching us in the middle of that conversation. And after several minutes, it eventually morphs into a more typical interviewing style, but that's why for those first few minutes, it's going to sound a little different, but that's just us in the moment. Now, of course, you can find out more about Tim on his site, on social media, although he doesn't use that too often, I don't think, and you can do the same for me. But after this episode, and my recap of my favorite scores from 2022, which should come pretty soon, I'm back on the regular schedule. So sit back and enjoy.
Did you see the theatrical version?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's even worse with the NC-17. I mean, you're missing, a whole slew of depraved scenes, let's say. I think the Academy, ignores horror, or I don't even know if I'd call this a horror film, but sci-fi thriller horror, hybrid, we'll call it.
Yeah, and when it was first being advertised, I thought it was going to be horror, and I guess Possessor was kind of pitched as a horror film, even though I don't think it's really that horror either.
Yeah.
It just exists in this weird sphere, and we find a need to put a label on it.
Yeah, and even calling something like body horror or something, it's doesn't really work because it's quite different in so many ways, and it's not thriller, it's not really sci-fi.
Yeah.
The beauty is the hybrids of those, that it's confusing, It's also comedy. The premiere I watched, everyone was laughing. There's almost one-liners, and it's if you come into it with a certain lighthearted sense of humor, it's a totally different experience,
Well, and that's something that I appreciate about it, and it does crack me up about those mindsets. I saw a lot of similar reactions to the Banshees of Inisherin, where it was labeled as a dark comedy, and so I saw a lot of people thinking it was going to, for whatever reason, a more lighthearted comedic movie. It's a funny movie, but it's also quite dark, and
yeah,
people just had a really tough time accepting that those two things can exist at once.
Yeah, when it's you come in with an expectation or a frame of understanding, it's almost better to not know anything about a film, and that's the downside of trailers that sometimes just spell out everything or telegraph the corniest narrative arc aspects, and then you frame this kind of mental projection of what it is. and you're kind of rigid in your interpretation of it, and you almost like expect something and then judge it against its flaws perceived from the way the trailer was constructed, you know?
It's such a ridiculous mindset, or, I mean, it's also an unfair framing or judgment because a trailer, especially a 30-second spot, can't tell you exactly what a movie's going to be and perfectly set your expectation.
Yeah.
If you've watched it and that's what your mind is set on, it's always going to be something different. There's rare times where I think a trailer is built to give you a mood,
Yeah.
like that the film is going to mirror. I mean, one example I remember is the movie Only God Forgives by Nicholas Winding Refn, and you watch the trailer, and it was coming off of Drive, and it looks like it's going to be, a faster-paced action movie. And anybody who saw the trailer thinking it was going to be like that came out hating that movie because there is some action, but it's really just like a very slow, stylish movie.
Yeah. It's like, I guess it's hard being a distributor that has to like convince people to leave their homes these days, and it's hard to get people in theaters, even if it plays in theaters, so it's like, I understand there's a marketing aspect that it's just you can't really get around, in some ways, and that's life. I try to just put horse blinders on and not really listen to anybody or like have any frame of interpretation, and that's always the best experience.
Yeah, I totally agree. And especially too with, so many times when a film is going to have twists and turns and you don't know exactly what the various beats are going to be.
Yeah.
When you go in and all you have is maybe a one sentence description and that's it. It's so fun being able to truly go along for the ride and not know where a turn's going to be and not know what's going to be on the other side of that turn.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, this film is like constructed in that way. It almost like pivots because it starts in almost a genre kind of way of like a certain cadence, and then it keeps hinging into derangement like slowly, And so the expectation of that is like kind of requires like a kind of adaptation and like psychically almost, This film's quite divisive in the sense that there's like people really love it, or some people have really visceral reactions against it, and it's like it's kind of also a litmus test of like your own, I would say, like flexibility in narrative and whether you can handle nonlinear narrative or things that are just kind of not really set up in a way that's like proper storytelling or something like that. Even that just gives me the kind of cringe. Something doesn't feel right about like even enforcing like proper storytelling, what that means. And that's like, I don't know, just in the backdrop of like TikTok planet that we're in and the way attention spans are shorter and shorter, how you can even talk about storytelling in that traditional way and really enforce it, where it's like, it's a bigger question, I guess.
One of the aspects I think about pushback on nonlinear storytelling, and it was certainly something that I've been guilty of, is I think for a lot of people interested in film, you might read screenplays or read books like Save the Cat or just be familiar with a more typical 3 or 5 act structure, or think that like a script has to have these certain beat points, things coming in 10% of the way through and 25%, etc. And so when things deviate from that, it then feels like you're rattling the cages against the like rigidity of what film is supposed to be. But then you start going back, and I just find having rules for any like hard rules like that for any art form is, I don't know, so constraining.
Yeah, and that's it. Like, do you want art or do you want like content tube kind of entertainment? And that's another litmus test of, I don't know. I'm drawn towards the auteurs and people that are like fucking with expectation a little bit. And, it's like what's interesting in terms of collaboration is Composer. I mean, no question. There's so much genre language, and it's quite stultifying, quite generic that just I like immediately like have a hard time with, and drawn towards the more open-ended creative approaches to storytelling and how music works with that,
And is that what drew you and drew your eye to this project in particular? I haven't seen Brandon Cronenberg's first film, but if you've seen Possessor, like, it's not a surprise that each film he's going to do is going to be on the stranger end and pushing against those boundaries and doing something different. So, like, was that enticing to you?
Yeah, I mean, I watched, I haven't seen Antiviral. I did watch Possessor, ironically, about like 2 months before, and it was in the middle of pandemic. I think it was like
Hmm.
lockdown 5, and I totally loved it. I thought it was just such a palpable, great, dreary, like Ontario dystopian story that wasn't really futuristic. It wasn't like campy throwback. It was like a really odd, idiosyncratic story that I loved. And just ironically, like a couple months later, got in touch about doing this film, and I was like, immediately intrigued. And yeah,
It's interesting mentioning that Possessor is kind of futuristic and dystopic, but it also feels like it can be 10 minutes in the future, for instance, because everything else seems really relatable. And that's kind of how Infinity Pool is too, where
yeah,
pretty much everything is feels like our world, and then there's just like one aspect that is futuristic or a piece of technology that we don't have, but that is still portrayed in a way that is like still feels like this, I don't know, analog age rundown piece of tech.
yeah. I think it's partly the way it's set on that island.
Yeah.
They have this futuristic cloning technology, but like it's not evident anywhere like how that manifests in its like cutting edge ability to replicate bodies. And a lot of it like feels very analog. And I think it's also related to how he shoots film. He does not use CGI. There's, from my understanding, like no green screen. It's a lot of in-camera effects. So there's almost a tactility to the image itself, even though it's very lush and like colorful and saturated at times. It's quite it's not vintage, but it's also not hyper futuristic.
Hmm.
And I just talking about music, that informs a lot of how you approach the score itself,
And with those in mind, how did those then influence the music choices? Because there's all these possible influences. On one end, it's this sort of exotic island tropical paradise that could be an obvious place of inspiration, although at times, like very early on, like the very first cue, you're getting these various shots of the island and it's beautiful, and the music is like totally subverting it and telling you, no, this might look beautiful, but
Yeah.
this is the only beauty you're ever going to experience in this film. But then, like,
Yeah.
there are the futuristic aspects, the analog aspects. There's just so many things that you could have pulled from. So, how did you end up figuring out, like, what sounds to employ?
Well, I mean, the first cue is like quite a kind of like almost neo Herman type of, almost like the camera's vertiginous, is almost spiral in its own way. So
Mm.
there's something to that like noir aspect of just he wanted a mood right off the bat that's like really has you by the throat, kind of in some sense. Not subtle about it, not like horror cues, but generally the arc is that it starts with more almost like placeholder or like stings or beat types of cues that follow different languages of genre, and then it at some point roughly about halfway through the film it starts to unfurl into a kind of more floral language. But he was pretty clear at the beginning that he wanted an electronic forward score that had aspects of like thriller horror movies in terms of its ecosystem, but obviously wanted me to do my thing. And so coming up with that language was the big challenge at the beginning. I wrote a bunch of music and sent it off at the editing phase. Read the script and, just started writing little doodles and things like that. I was kind of focused on a few things. One was like this kind of like almost a vocoder type of digital voice synthesis that almost represented some kind of heart of the island country's like technology that led to
Mm.
the replicants. So I was working with voice transformation. I was also, a big thing was taking cicada sounds. I like ripped like hours of YouTube Mediterranean cicada sounds, and then I had them trigger these string, you should call like modular synthesis, but triggering these string types of pulses that end up sounding kind of like this banjo. And I was trying to make almost like a Deliverance equivalent of some sort, like some kind of feeling of the backwoods, but of this mythical island country that's vaguely Baltic, but Black Sea, but also not at all. The percussive patterns were from cicadas, essentially, and that was a kind of another element that was like infused throughout the score. And then just writing music, a lot of electronic stuff. And the only actual studio session I had was French horn in a bunch of the cues. Everything else was just written by me.
That's wild. And so at that point, did you get absolutely sick of the sound of cicadas? Because they can, like, when you're out at the right time in Chicago, for instance, like, and there that sound's going, it is such a powerful, deafening, like, slightly unnerving sound.
Yeah, if you've ever been to the Mediterranean in like afternoon, there's just this in the summer, it's just this palpable, like the landscape on the water just kind of like pulses with these bugs that live underground and then make their sound. And it's crazy, it's hypnotic. And I just thought a lot about that. And it was like kind of, I tried different instruments that didn't really work. I was considering like hurdy-gurdy and like what would be some kind of instrumentation that would almost like signify like a kind of regressive but also future forward dystopian mythical island stay. And I was trying a bunch of different things and yeah, ended up the way I did with the current score.
That's awesome. To take us on a little tangent, then, how similar is that sort of approach with your approach to writing music for your solo Tim Hecker releases?
There's similarities for sure, but writing to picture is a totally different thing. And the more I do it, the more, it's a skill, incredibly so. I think everything starts with an improvisation, in a general sense, like writing a melody, a line, a short motif that, becomes like some kind of heart and soul of a piece. No matter what its end purpose is, it needs to have some kind of core, whether it's like a chord pattern, a progression, or it's some counterpoint type of thing or a melody. And then from there it expands, into its like journey it needs to take. And yeah, I would say like improvisation's at the heart of like everything I've done, exploration and giving some oxygen to just think a bit bigger than the specific cue, and what needs, something to be done. I don't like just walking up to a DAW and opening a bunch of string instruments and writing a thing and then print. I mean, it's always a lot more convoluted. It's a lot of, yeah, play and improvisation and writing over things and then ditching the thing that was there before. Like iterations of transformation is what I really love as a composer.
Doing those iterations, do you ever, and I don't know how many versions of, let's say, a particular cue or melody or run through something that you might do, but do you ever get to a point where you've done, let's say, 20 passes, 20 attempts, 20 versions of something, and you either go, you know what, I feel like I'm kind of spinning my wheels on this,
Oh yeah,
or maybe I should go back to version 6 and scrap the last 14 ones that I've done because I'm getting nowhere.
100%. I think like a real indicator of like skill at writing music is to be savage in your own, severe in your own editing and knowing when it's cooked, or when it's overcooked. And very often it's like the first take is the best. There's something about it that's just, it's this unchained, that's liberated, that doesn't have this kind of panging after something, that it doesn't work out. Sometimes it is version 6. Very, very rarely is it version 20 though. When you're doing a cue and things need, the subtle changes that require like shaping and forming and hitting beats and stuff like that, you may need 20 versions. But in terms of writing the heart and soul of some music, I think that that's often done right off the bat. Like the last cue, for example, of Infinity Pool is just improvisation piece, really. Like literally, I couldn't do it again. I tried to like make a better version with more space and having channels separated so they could be mixed properly. But in the end, that piece was just something I did in like about a year ago in February last year, upon reading the script and seeing a couple of dailies just to feel like what this film was kind of materializing into, it was impossible to go back because I didn't stem out my improvisation and it was a stereo file. Most of the time I tend to record a bit more, but it requires a lot of hard drive space and being ready that when the motivation kind of strikes you and the kind of inspiration, you're able to actually record that properly.
Do you then get to a point sometimes where maybe an improvisation isn't, 100% spot on, but also there are aspects that you really want to keep and have like a difficult time replicating it?
Yeah. Absolutely. And that's like requires some flexibility and
Mm.
openness about maybe you just do another improvisation of the first few bars of a piece and then cut into the original. And, a lot of mutations and mutants in terms of it doesn't need to be all in one take in one room. I've done other scores where it's a lot more live instrumentation, a lot more writing out pieces in advance and doing sessions with real musicians. But when you're doing a real fast hybrid electronic score like this, it's, a different approach, and it's a lot more plastic and mutable or malleable, I should say.
On that point, talking about putting together something quickly, but also that you were working on at least part of it back in February, what was the timeline for this score like? When were you working on it, and how long was the process?
I think the conversation started in late January, and then by February, I took a couple weeks in Mexico writing music in Oaxaca, and I was writing my own solo music, and I was also writing some of this stuff. I think I was ready to go in March. It ended up being pushed a bit with editing. The editing, I think, carried on a couple more months, but I was like, by, I would say, May, in the deep of it through till the summer. And then we had mix probably in July or August. It was done. I would say it's about 2 or 3 months of like intensive focus on it. It was a lot of music. I think there's something like 80 minutes roughly
Really?
of music to picture. I think a few of the pieces didn't make it on the soundtrack, but I kept most of it, And I did keep the sequencing quite linearly, where I think like some of the more musically interesting cues are like later in the film and the soundtrack. It's still set up the way to respect the kind of lineage of the arc of the film.
On that point, then, well, first, and it's something I want to get to a little later, is talking about the actual amount of music and the balance of that between sound design, because some of the sequences just get so wild, it's like hard to even know what's what.
Yeah.
But talking about the soundtrack release itself, what's the process of paring it down from 80 minutes to, I don't know what it is, 50 minutes, and then how and when do you make the decision of whether to move the sequencing so it becomes kind of its own bespoke journey versus keeping the sequencing relatively intact to mirror the film?
I don't know. I've done it both ways. Like the last score I did in soundtrack was called The North Water, which I believe I did it a lot more non-linearly and like, made it a listening experience based on the music of the soundtrack. But some of those were pieces that ended up getting chopped. I kept longer versions. I made it a bit more like a kind of notepad of that period of my life working on this project. And, this one's more straightforward. This is the score in a almost documentarian style. No edifice, no crossfades, no layering of pieces, no extended versions. If it's on the soundtrack, it's in the film, and there's not much change. Where in The North Water, I really made it a creative, music from the score. And, there's some rejected versions even in there that I thought were great music. I think I didn't add too many pieces that didn't really work out, but this was kind of like what I turned my attention to during the pandemic. Was scoring was a great opportunity to expand on something I've always wanted to do. And I went full guns wild into that, and it was really great.
Like, how long has that interest been simmering within you? I know that there are always like quite a few musicians, composers that are making their own music that have some sort of desire to do it, but I guess it's been pandemic push, but it really seems like the last year and a half, 2 years with the North Waters, and then with Infinity Pool, that like, and maybe it's just the bigger stage, but like it feels like a much bigger move on your part.
Yeah, I think it's like even if you're told your whole life that you make cinematic music or whatever, it doesn't really equate to like a lot of quality scoring opportunities. And grateful for all the like directors that have reached out in the past and wanted to work together. I have done a few things in the past, definitely, that have been interesting, but that kind of back catalog or that kind of work history doesn't amount to much in terms of like being trusted with delivering score to picture with sophistication and elegance on time, under time pressure and financial pressure. It's a totally different thing. It's a totally different skill that you really are expected to kind of grow into, and people get different opportunities at different times. And I'm just grateful for the people I've been able to work with thus far, and I think it's all been in its right time. And I'm not looking to do this full time, but it's definitely something I enjoy doing. I feel like I've grown a lot in this kind of approach to writing music. Also, I have to say, like, my music editor, Hannes Platemeyer, was like super helpful in this. Like, we work a bit different than a lot of traditional music editors that are more of a like Pro Tools type of setup where, liaising between the composer and the mix stage. Hannes was very involved in the creative aspect in terms of like working on specific cues with me. And, some of the ones were more his work than mine, even in terms of editing a few of the dream sequences and stuff that were quite like hyper chopped. Yeah, it's like the people you work with definitely matters as well in terms of being able to handle all the pressures and constraints and deliverables that you have to do doing film composition.
Do you think that maybe some of the stylings of your solo music, and especially, and sometimes I hate using like the term ambient, but like if we want to put broad buckets of making music that's more ambient facing, let's say, do you think that has affected or been an impediment to moving into scoring just because it's not necessarily the type of music you hear all the time in films or shows?
I think it's used a lot. Like, I think a lot of the music history of the last 20 years has been churned up by film composers and kind of replicated. Like, USC's composing graduate can genericize a bunch of like hybrid ambient electronic music in about 10 minutes, whether it's like auteur grade or not is another question. But I think that I bristle, like, I'm grateful that I'm seen as like a ambient musician or have that history, but I've really like tried to not adhere. I've always thought that the term is not helpful. I've like never tried to follow in like the footsteps of some let's call it like a neo Brian Eno type of form of making music. I object to the idea of the original characterization of ambient as, sonic furniture in a room. I just think it's corny. I like music that can function at full blast, like almost antagonistically present in the sound field, or stuff that disappears into like the ether, that functions on both levels. That's something more interesting to me as a concept, and I don't think that's ambient. And I've gone to the point where I just like try to subvert it, like I have a record that's coming out in a few months that's pulses that I just couldn't do pads or placid soundscapes. Like that type of music is like comes naturally to me, but I also feel that ambient has become this kind of almost like stultifying genre. It functions almost the way like a James Turrell, who I love, but is, deployed in the backdrop of keeping up with the Kardashians or something. It's like, it's almost like a corporate panacea for our anxious times. I want music to function on a lot higher level than just be a kind of auditory Xanax, And then it's just also a form of music replicated for the times we live in now. I still believe in, music having a different, more complex function with listening and experiencing sound.
Reminds me of, I think it was Harold Budd who like fervently objected to being called an ambient musician, an ambient
Really?
composer as well.
Did he?
Yeah. I think he was like very anti that. I mean, and even Brian Eno, I know that he's like considered one of the godfathers of it, but at the same time, he has such a wide range of music that he's done too. To even have an idea of what ambient is and then push him solely into that hole is very limiting as well.
Well, I think he himself owes a bit of the blame on that because he, is quite eager to almost formalize the mode and explain it in a pedantic way in his essays on ambient music at that point in the liner notes of some of his early ambient series works. I mean, that's on him, and it's not his fault that became kind of like genre kind of codifying or canonized or whatever. It's not to disrespect that. I just think that thinking about the function of music in terms of society and whether it's, for listening to music on its own or with picture is a much more complex thing than that.
And do you think part of it is also, and this is a more broader concept or idea, but like people's relationship to listening to music changing over time? Part of that is, for me, I can remember, I don't know, 15, 18 years ago, like getting a new CD and then putting that in my CD player and just like sitting in bed listening to it over and over. And I just don't,
Obsessively. because you
Oh
walked
yeah,
to a store and got your money and bought it, and then you looked at the liner notes and you thought about the process and its enigma of like, renting an expensive studio to record all that, and then the
yeah,
process of making the CD and its singularity and its like importance and the way you got kind of excited about it is really different than the way it is now delivered through streaming platforms. No question. Listening has changed. There's no question about it. It's, in some ways cheapened music societally. And I think that that's also something that's happened in cycles in the past. Music's been like the kind of jungler if you look back and like, oh man, I'm gonna get the history wrong, but just like the nature of like the bard playing under the king's table trying to get a bone of meat thrown down, is like literally the hobo that went from town to town. I'm talking like 18th century roughly. I sound probably crazy discussing this, but there's been cycles in which music is venerated and then disparaged. And I think we're not in a full disparage cycle, but it's happened in the past. And I think streaming platforms and digitization of music's had a massive impact on the way we listen. It's not the sole cause, but it's changed things. And going back and wishing we're in the golden era of recording where it's vinyl or CDs, even CD was like a kind of period of malaise, the digitization was taking out the analog
Hmm.
body of music into this vaporous code, and now we look for these like vintage CD converters that had more warmth than you get through the Spotify algorithm now. So it's ironic in some ways. Yeah, I just think that relationships to listening are always in flux historically, and
Hmm. Yeah, and that's, I don't know. I personally always have a tough time with it because, like, I listen to music digitally, like streaming, and then I buy a lot of digital music. But there's a part of me that misses going to, like, when I was in college, going to the used music store where you wonder how the hell, like, are they even in business, and going
yeah.
through the 10,000 CDs they had, or for a period where I had a record player, like going through the vinyl and having that tactile feel of it and developing a much stronger connection to whatever the single piece, or maybe you're buying five things, but like there's just something that's so much, I don't know, so much closer.
Lead you on these tangents. If you're like, you pick up a Philip Glass CD when you're 17 and you're like, who's Michael Nyman? And then you go
Mm-hmm.
off and, you're in a whole other universe. And that, might lead you to other things. And that type of tangential listening has kind of been decapitated a little bit in the way accreditation happens in music. And like, it still takes a bunch of people to make a record that might have one person's name on it. When you lose the liner notes, you lose that kind of depth of like, if you're a music geek, like seems like we both are, you lose that you have to dig harder. Obviously, there's ways you can do it, but it's not as easy. And I still think like, it's a great time to make music. I think that it's harder than maybe it was 20 years ago. I don't know. All I know is that I'm grateful to be able to do this, for a living. I never planned on it happening. I trained as a historian, also had a day job at some point in my life. I've avoided being a careerist out of doing this. And it,
Mm.
despite my efforts to kind of sabotage that, it kept happening and worked out, Yeah. So it's odd and I'm super grateful. There's no question about it.
Well, I think that's a good place to wrap up after
Yeah.
after ruminating on the malaise of modern music, having a nice positive note to leave everyone off on.
Absolutely.
Tim, once again, I really appreciate you sitting down to chat with me for a little bit, talk about Infinity Pool, and then go on a 20-minute winding tangent about music generally. But I love it.
I think that the philosophical or artistic stuff's like really the kind of the great fuel behind it. The reason I personally keep going. Thank you so much.
Hey, thank you, man, and have a great rest of the week.
For sure. You too. Take it easy.